December 1944. Somewhere in the Carpathian Mountains, a Soviet officer steps forward to survey the terrain ahead. He is exposed for perhaps 3 seconds. 1,200 yards away, a young Austrian lies motionless in the snow, his breath barely visible in the freezing air. Through his Zeiss 6-power scope, the crosshairs settle on the target. One squeeze of the trigger, the officer drops. The shooter does not move. He never fires twice from the same position. He waits, invisible, patient, deadly. By the time the war ends, this man will have 345 confirmed kills to his name, the highest total of any German sniper in the Second World War. But when the Third Reich collapses in May 1945, his war will be far from over. Captured by the Soviets, he will spend 5 years in prison camps, enduring conditions that killed hundreds of thousands of his countrymen. When he finally returns home, he will speak almost nothing of what he did. For the rest of his life, Matthias Hetzenauer will live quietly in the same Austrian village where he was born. A carpenter, a husband, a man who once held the power of life and death in his hands, but chose to let that part of himself fade into silence. The story of Germany's deadliest sniper begins not on the battlefield, but in the alpine valleys of the Austrian Tyrol. Matthias Hetzenauer was born on 23 December 1924 in Brixen im Theiler, a small village nestled in the Kitzbühel Alps near the German border. His parents, Simon and Magdalena Hetzenauer, were descendants of generations of Tyrolean peasantry who had worked the land in this rugged mountain region for as long as anyone could remember. The family lived on a small farm called the Sonnleitbauernhof, where young Matthias spent his childhood tending livestock and learning the rhythms of rural alpine life. What set the Hetzenauer household apart was Simon's reputation as an exceptional hunter. The Tyrolean Alps were home to chamois, a species of goat antelope that inhabited the steep mountain slopes and rocky crags above the tree line. Hunting chamois required extraordinary patience, stealth, and marksmanship. The animals were wary and quick, and the terrain demanded shots at extreme distances, often from awkward positions on unstable ground. From an early age, Matthias accompanied his father into the mountains, learning to track prey across difficult terrain, to control his breathing, and to make accurate shots at ranges that would challenge even experienced marksmen. By the time he reached adolescence, the skills that would later make him lethal on the Eastern Front were already deeply ingrained. The political upheavals that transformed Europe in the 1930s did not spare the quiet villages of the Tyrol. In March 1938, Nazi Germany annexed Austria in the event known as the Anschluss. Overnight, Austria ceased to exist as an independent nation, and its citizens became subjects of the Third Reich. For the Hetzenauer family and their neighbors, the immediate effects were subtle but unmistakable. The Austrian army was absorbed into the Wehrmacht, and young men across the former nation found themselves subject to German conscription laws. The mountain infantry traditions of the old Austrian army were preserved in the new Gebirgsjäger divisions, elite light infantry units trained for warfare in mountainous terrain. Matthias Hetzenauer completed his elementary schooling and continued working on his family's farm as Europe descended into war. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, beginning the conflict that would eventually consume the continent. For the first years of the war, Hetzenauer remained in the Tyrol, but in September 1942, at the age of 17, he received his conscription notice. He was assigned to the 140th Mountain Rifle Reinforcement Battalion at Kufstein, a garrison town in the Austrian Alps that served as a training center for Gebirgsjäger units. There, he underwent basic military training before being released. Back to civilian life. The respite was short-lived. In January 1943, another call-up order arrived, directing him to report to the training area at Seetaler Alpe in Styria, where the Wehrmacht's elite mountain troops gathered for advanced instruction. At Seetaler Alpe, Hetzenauer's exceptional marksmanship quickly caught the attention of his superiors. The training area, located in the mountains of southeastern Austria, was one of the Wehrmacht's primary facilities for developing sniper skills among Gebirgsjäger units. Here, the best shots from mountain divisions across the Eastern Front converged to learn the specialized craft of long-range precision shooting. The curriculum covered far more than simple marksmanship. Trainees learned camouflage techniques, field observation, wind correction, range estimation, and the psychological discipline required to remain motionless for hours while waiting for a target. They studied how to select firing positions, how to move unseen through hostile terrain, and how to disengage without being detected after taking a shot. Hetzenauer spent most of 1943 in various stages of training before being formally enrolled in the sniper course at Seetaler Alpe from March to July 1944. During these 4 months, he mastered the weapons that would become extensions of his own body on the battlefield. The primary sniper rifle of the German army was the Karabiner 98K, a bolt-action weapon descended from the legendary Mauser rifles that had served German soldiers since the late 19th century. Sniper variants of the Kar 98K were selected at the factory for their exceptional accuracy during test firing, then fitted with telescopic sights by skilled armourers. Hetzenauer was issued a Kar 98K with a 6-power Zeiss scope, an optical system that represented the finest precision engineering available in wartime Germany. He also trained with the Gewehr 43, a semi-automatic rifle that offered faster follow-up shots at the cost of slightly reduced accuracy at extreme ranges. The G43 was fitted with a 4-power ZF4 scope and proved useful in situations where targets might appear briefly or when multiple enemies needed to be engaged in rapid succession. The Austrian connection to German sniper excellence was no coincidence. The Tyrolean Alps had produced marksmen for centuries, and the traditional hunting culture of the region instilled precisely the skills that made effective snipers. Patience was paramount, both when stalking chamois through rocky terrain and when waiting for an enemy officer to expose himself. Stealth came naturally to men who had learned to move silently through mountain forests without disturbing their prey. The ability to estimate range across the deceptive distances of alpine valleys translated directly to the skill of gauging holdover for long shots on the battlefield, and the discipline required to make one clean kill rather than wounding an animal and letting it escape was exactly the mindset a sniper needed. Among the top German snipers of the war, Austrians from mountain regions were dramatically overrepresented, a testament to the enduring relevance of civilian hunting skills in modern warfare. By the time Hetzenauer completed his training in July 1944, the war on the Eastern Front had turned decisively against Germany. The massive Soviet offensives of 1943 and early 1944 had shattered Army Group South and driven the Wehrmacht back hundreds of miles. The great industrial centers of Ukraine had been liberated, and the Red Army was pressing westward toward the Carpathian Mountains that formed the natural barrier between the Soviet Union and Central Europe. It was into this cauldron that Hetzenauer was deployed as a Gefreiter, the lowest enlisted rank, assigned to the 7th Company of Gebirgsjäger Regiment 144 within the 3rd Mountain Division. The 3rd Mountain Division had been formed in 1938 from elements of the old Austrian Army's 5th and 7th Divisions, following the Anschluss. Composed primarily of Austrian and Bavarian mountain troops, the division had fought in Poland in 1939, Norway in 1940, and the Arctic Front in 1941, before being transferred to the southern sector of the Eastern Front. By mid-1944, the division was engaged in the brutal defensive fighting that characterized the Wehrmacht's slow retreat across Ukraine. Hetzenauer joined his unit in the Carpathian Mountains, where the terrain resembled the alpine landscape of his homeland, but the circumstances could not have been more different. The Carpathians in the summer and autumn of 1944 were a killing ground. Soviet forces pushed relentlessly westward, attempting to break through the mountain passes into Hungary and cut off German forces in Romania. The Wehrmacht, desperately short of men and equipment after years of attrition, relied increasingly on defensive tactics that exploited the difficult terrain. For a sniper, the conditions were ideal. Long sight lines across mountain valleys allowed engagement at extreme ranges. Rocky outcrops and dense forests provided concealment. The Soviet infantry, pressing forward in waves, presented abundant targets. Hetzenauer went to work. The young Austrian's first confirmed kills came in August 1944, shortly after joining his unit. From the beginning, he demonstrated the patience and discipline that would make him extraordinary. Unlike soldiers who might empty a magazine in the heat of combat, Hetzenauer followed the cardinal rules of the sniper: positively identify every target before firing, never shoot twice from the same position, and always plan your escape route before taking the first shot. He moved forward of German lines, sometimes crawling for hours to reach a position that offered the right combination of concealment and clear fields of fire. Once in position, he would wait, sometimes for an entire day, watching Soviet positions through his scope and waiting for the right target to appear. His preferred targets were officers and NCOs, the men whose loss would disrupt Soviet command and control. He learned to identify them by their bearing, their uniforms, their habit of consulting maps or issuing orders. Political commissars were also high-value targets, recognizable by their distinctive insignia. Machine gunners, mortar crews, and anyone carrying specialized equipment drew his attention. Each kill was recorded only if witnessed by an officer or NCO from his own unit, a requirement that meant many of Hetzenauer's victims went uncounted in his official tally. Estimates suggest his actual kills may have been double his confirmed number. The Kar 98K that Hetzenauer carried was an instrument of remarkable precision in the right hands. With the 6-power Zeiss scope properly zeroed, the rifle could reliably hit man-sized targets at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. Hetzenauer's longest confirmed kill was recorded at 1,100 meters, roughly 1,200 yards, a distance at which the bullet would take nearly 2 seconds to reach its target and drop several feet from the original point of aim. Making such a shot required not only technical skill but also the ability to calculate bullet drop, compensate for wind drift, and predict the movement of the target during the bullet's flight time. The thin mountain air of the Carpathians helped somewhat, reducing air resistance and allowing bullets to maintain velocity over longer distances. But the wind, swirling through the valleys and passes, added an unpredictable element that only experience could overcome. The German sniper doctrine that shaped Hetzenauer's approach to combat had evolved significantly since the early years of the war. At the beginning of the conflict, the Wehrmacht had paid relatively little attention to sniper warfare, viewing it as a secondary capability rather than a specialized discipline. The devastating effectiveness of Soviet snipers on the Eastern Front, particularly during the brutal urban fighting at Stalingrad, forced a rapid reassessment. Beginning in 1943, the German army established dedicated sniper training schools and developed systematic programs to identify and develop talented marksmen within infantry units. The curriculum at facilities like Seetaler Alpe drew on lessons learned from the front, emphasizing fieldcraft, camouflage, and psychological resilience alongside pure marksmanship. Hetzenauer also employed specialized ammunition for specific tactical purposes. Tracer rounds, while less accurate than standard heavy-pointed bullets due to their different ballistic characteristics, allowed snipers to observe the flight path of their shots and make corrections for wind drift. Observation ammunition, which produced a small flash and puff of smoke on impact, helped verify hits at extreme ranges and could be used to ignite structures where enemies were sheltering. Both types were used sparingly, as their visible signatures could compromise a sniper's position, but they provided valuable capabilities when circumstances demanded them. Through the autumn of 1944, Hetzenauer accumulated kills at a remarkable rate. The 3rd Mountain Division fell back through the Carpathians into Slovakia and eastern Hungary, fighting rearguard actions that cost both sides heavily. The terrain favored the defenders, and German snipers extracted a disproportionate toll on Soviet attackers. Hetzenauer's reputation grew within his division, as soldiers whispered about the quiet young Austrian who seemed to hit whatever he aimed at. His fellow sniper, Josef Allerberger, another Austrian from the same division, was building his own lethal record nearby. The two sometimes operated together, coordinating their fire to create overlapping fields of death that Soviet infantry learned to fear. On 6 November 1944, Hetzenauer's luck nearly ran out. Soviet artillery, the great equalizer that no amount of skill could counter, found his position. A shell exploded nearby and shrapnel tore into his head. He survived, but the wound was serious enough to earn him the wound badge in black 3 days later. After medical treatment, he returned to duty, the head wound leaving no apparent effect on his marksmanship. By this point, his confirmed kill count was approaching 200. The final months of the war brought the heaviest fighting and the highest death tolls. The Red Army, now vastly superior in numbers and equipment, launched massive offensives designed to crush German resistance and end the war as quickly as possible. The 3rd Mountain Division, reduced to a fraction of its original strength, was thrown into one defensive battle after another across Hungary and Slovakia. Hetzenauer continued his grim work, covering the retreat of his comrades and exacting a price for every kilometer of ground the Soviets gained. By April 1945, Hetzenauer's confirmed kill count had reached 345, a number that represented the equivalent of 2 full-strength enemy. Companies eliminated by a single soldier. General Lieutenant Paul Klatt, the division commander, took notice. On 17 April 1945, Klatt recommended Hetzenauer for the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, Germany's highest military decoration for bravery on the battlefield. The recommendation cited Hetzenauer's numerous kills, achieved without regard for his own safety under artillery fire and enemy attacks. The recommendation was approved by General der Gebirgstruppe Karl von Lesueur and General der Panzertruppe Walter Nehring, and the award was confirmed. At 20 years old, Matthias Hetzenauer had received the most prestigious honor a German soldier could earn. The decoration meant little in practical terms. By mid-April 1945, the Third Reich was in its final death throes. Hitler had retreated to his bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin. Soviet forces were closing in from all directions. The 3rd Mountain Division, like most German units in the east, faced a stark choice: surrender to the Soviets and face an uncertain fate, or attempt to fight westward and surrender to the Americans or British. The division chose to fight on, retreating through Czechoslovakia toward what they hoped would be the safety of American lines. They did not make it. In May 1945, just weeks after receiving his Knight's Cross, Matthias Hetzenauer was captured by Soviet troops. The war that had made him Germany's deadliest sniper was over. A different kind of ordeal was about to begin. The Soviet Union held approximately 3 million German prisoners of war at the end of the Second World War. For these men, the end of combat marked the beginning of a new nightmare. Soviet prison camps scattered across the vast expanse of the USSR, from Eastern Europe to Siberia, were places of deliberate hardship where cold, hunger, disease, and forced labor killed hundreds of thousands. Mortality rates varied by camp and by year, but historians estimate that somewhere between 350,000 and 1 million German POWs died in Soviet captivity. The odds were particularly bad for anyone captured in the final months of the war, when the flood of prisoners overwhelmed an already strained Soviet system. Hetzenauer's specific experiences in captivity remain largely unknown. He rarely spoke of this period in later life, and no detailed accounts of his imprisonment have survived. What is known is that he spent 5 years in Soviet camps, enduring conditions that broke many men who survived and killed many who did not. The standard experience for German POWs included inadequate food rations that kept prisoners in a state of chronic malnutrition, exposure to extreme temperatures without adequate clothing or shelter, forced labor in mines, forests, and construction sites, and medical care that ranged from minimal to non-existent. Disease swept through the camps regularly, and those who weakened from hunger or illness often died within days. For a sniper like Hetzenauer, capture carried additional risks. Soviet forces had learned to fear German snipers, and captured sharpshooters were sometimes subjected to harsh treatment or summary execution. The fact that Hetzenauer survived suggests either that his captors did not know his specialty, or that the chaos of the war's end prevented the kind of targeted retribution that might have occurred earlier in the conflict. Either way, he entered the Soviet camp system as just another prisoner, one more German soldier among millions awaiting an uncertain fate. The last significant wave of releases came in 1953-1956, following diplomatic efforts by West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. Hetzenauer was released on 10 January 1950, almost 5 years after his capture. The circumstances of his release are unclear. Austrian POWs were generally repatriated faster than Germans, which may have worked in his favor despite Austria's annexation into the Reich during the war. His relatively low rank may also have helped, as the Soviets focused their prosecutorial efforts on officers and men suspected of specific atrocities. Whatever the reason, he was among the fortunate minority who survived Soviet captivity and lived to see their homeland again. The Austria to which Hetzenauer returned was a changed place. The country had been separated from Germany after the war and divided into occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Unlike Germany, Austria would eventually be reunified under a neutral government, but in 1950, the future remained uncertain. The economy was still recovering from the devastation of war and occupation. Cities bore the scars of bombing, and food remained scarce in many areas. Brixen im Thaler, the village where Hetzenauer had grown up, had escaped the worst of the war's destruction. The Alpine valleys of the Tyrol were far from the major battlefields and strategic targets, and the traditional farming communities had continued their lives with relatively little disruption beyond the loss of their young men to conscription. When Hetzenauer returned, he found a place that, as he later remarked, seemed to have slept through the entire war. The mountains still rose above the valley, the farm still dotted the slopes, and the routines of rural life continued as they had for generations. Hetzenauer chose to rebuild his life in the place where it had begun. He took up his father's trade as a carpenter, a skilled profession that provided steady work in a region where wooden construction was the norm. He married a woman named Maria, and the couple settled into the quiet existence that would define the rest of his years. There would be no memoirs, no lecture tours, no attempts to capitalize on his wartime reputation. The man who had killed 345 Soviet soldiers became a craftsman who built things rather than destroying them. His silence about the war was not unusual among veterans of his generation. German and Austrian soldiers who had served on the Eastern Front often found themselves in an awkward position after 1945. They had fought for a regime that was now universally condemned, in a war that had brought catastrophe to their own countries as well as to the nations they had invaded. Many of the techniques that had made them effective soldiers, including the calculated killing at which snipers excelled, seemed obscene in peacetime. The society to which they returned was eager to move forward, not to dwell on the details of what had happened. Veterans learned to keep their experiences to themselves, sharing them only with others who had been there and would understand. For Hetzenauer, there may have been additional reasons for silence. Sniping occupied a morally ambiguous space in the ethics of warfare. Unlike the soldier who kills in the heat of battle, the sniper chooses his victims deliberately, often watching them through a scope for extended periods before pulling the trigger. The intimacy of the act, seeing a man's face clearly before ending his life, left psychological marks that many snipers struggled to process. The pride in technical achievement that accompanied a long-range kill was often accompanied by a deeper discomfort that emerged only in reflection. Hetzenauer's refusal to discuss his wartime experiences may have reflected not just social pressure, but a personal need to distance himself from what he had done. Allied military intelligence teams who studied German sniper operations after the war reached mixed conclusions about their effectiveness and ethics. American and British reports acknowledged the tactical value of precision shooting, but also noted the psychological burden it placed on both the snipers themselves and the soldiers who faced them. Soviet assessments, filtered through the ideological lens of the Cold War, portrayed German snipers as criminal killers, while simultaneously acknowledging the need to develop equivalent capabilities. The detailed German records of confirmed kills, which required officer verification, provided researchers with unusually complete data on sniper effectiveness, data that would influence military doctrine for decades to come. The equipment that Hetzenauer and his fellow snipers used also attracted significant post-war attention. American ordnance teams evaluated captured Kar 98K sniper variants and Zeiss telescopic sights, testing their accuracy against comparable Allied systems. The results confirmed what German snipers had learned through experience. The combination of precision-manufactured rifles and high-quality optics produced a weapon system capable of remarkable accuracy at ranges that exceeded the practical capabilities of most infantry rifles. Some of the techniques developed by German snipers, including the use of umbrella frames woven with foliage as portable camouflage, were documented and later incorporated into Allied sniper training programs. The war was over, but the lessons it taught continued to shape military thinking. The decades that followed brought gradual changes to Brixen im Thale and to Austria as a whole. The occupation ended in 1955, and Austria emerged as a prosperous neutral nation that successfully navigated the tensions of the Cold War. Tourism transformed the Tyrolean Alps, bringing visitors from across Europe to ski in winter and hike in summer. The old farming economy gave way to a service-oriented model, though traditional crafts like carpentry remained in demand. Hetzenauer adapted to these changes, continuing his work and raising his family as the village around him evolved. In the broader historical community, interest in German snipers of the Second World War grew during the latter half of the 20th century. Researchers began documenting the experiences of men like Hetzenauer and Allerberger, attempting to understand both the technical aspects of their craft and the human dimensions of their service. The official records of the German military, though incomplete, provided basic information about kill counts and decorations. Former snipers who were willing to speak offered insights into training methods, equipment, and tactics. Gradually, a picture emerged of how the Wehrmacht had developed its sniper program and how individual soldiers had operated within it. Hetzenauer's name appeared in these histories, but he declined to participate directly. Unlike his fellow Austrian Joseph Allerberger, who eventually cooperated with an author to produce a memoir, Hetzenauer gave no interviews and wrote nothing about his experiences. The few details known about his wartime service came from official records and the recollections of others who had served with him. His silence only added to the mystique that surrounded his name in military history circles, where he was recognized as one of the deadliest snipers of the war on any side. The question of how to remember men like Hetzenauer remained contentious in the decades after the war. Were they heroes who had served their country with extraordinary skill and bravery? Were they war criminals who had participated in a regime of unprecedented evil? Were they simply soldiers doing their duty in circumstances not of their choosing? Different observers reached different conclusions, often depending on their own national perspective and political beliefs. Soviet and later Russian accounts emphasized the suffering inflicted by German snipers and the justice of the harsh treatment they received in captivity. German and Austrian military historians tended to focus on technical proficiency and individual courage while acknowledging the broader context of the criminal regime the soldiers had served. Hetzenauer himself offered no guidance on how he wished to be remembered. He lived his final decades in the same village where he had been born, watching as the world moved on from the conflicts that had defined his youth. His wife Maria remained by his side, sharing the quiet life he had chosen after the chaos of war and captivity. Whatever thoughts he had about his 345 confirmed kills, about the men he had watched die through his scope, about the years of imprisonment that followed, he kept to himself. Matthias Hetzenauer died on 3rd October 2004 in Brixen im Thale, Austria. He was 79 years old. His death came almost exactly 60 years after he had first arrived on the Eastern Front as a newly trained sniper and almost 55 years after his release from Soviet captivity. His wife Maria survived him by 2 years, passing away in 2006 at the age of 81. They are buried together in the local cemetery of Brixen im Thale, in Section 3, Row 3, their graves marked by simple headstones that give no indication of the extraordinary history that lies beneath. The memory of Germany's deadliest sniper lives on primarily in the pages of military history books and the discussions of enthusiasts who study the technical aspects of long-range shooting. A biography by Roland Kaltenegger, published under the title Eastern Front Sniper, The Life of Matthias Hetzenauer, remains the most comprehensive account of his wartime service, though it relies heavily on official records and the testimony of others rather than the subject's own words. The book was translated into English and other languages, reaching audiences around the world who were curious about the men who had practiced the deadly art of precision, shooting in the most brutal conflict in human history. In the broader sweep of Second World War history, Hetzenauer's story illustrates several themes that extend far beyond one man's experience. The Austrian Tyrol's tradition of mountain hunting produced many of Germany's best snipers, a reminder of how civilian skills could be transformed into military assets. The brutal nature of the Eastern Front, where both sides committed atrocities and showed little mercy to prisoners, created conditions that encouraged the development of specialized killers on both sides. The fate of German POWs in Soviet camps represented one aspect of the enormous human cost extracted by the war. A cost measured not just in battlefield deaths, but in years of suffering that continued long after the fighting ended. And the silence that descended over veterans like Hetzenauer reflected a society's complicated relationship with its own recent past. A past that could neither be openly celebrated nor easily forgotten. The village of Brixen im Thale today shows few traces of its connection to one of history's deadliest snipers. Tourists visit for the skiing and the hiking, drawn by the same alpine beauty that shaped Matthias Hetzenauer's early life. The local cemetery holds the graves of generations of Tyrolean farmers and craftsmen, including one young man who left these mountains in 1942 and returned 7 years later bearing scars that no one would ever see. The skills he learned hunting chamois in these peaks made him lethal on the slopes of the Carpathians, and the patience he developed waiting for prey served him well in the endless hours of stillness that sniper work required. He killed more enemy soldiers than anyone else in the German army. and then he came home and built things with his hands until the day he died. There is perhaps something fitting in that quiet ending. The sniper's craft is fundamentally solitary, a discipline that rewards silence and self-containment. Hetzenauer carried those qualities into his post-war life, asking nothing from a society that had little to offer veterans of his war and giving nothing in return except honest work and family devotion. He watched as historians and journalists discovered his name and sought his story, and he declined their requests with the same patience he had once applied to waiting for Soviet officers to step into his crosshairs.